Section 1, the precession of the equinoxes and the idea of world ages. It is well known, even to modern school children, that the heavens are not fixed but move with a stately regularity and immutability that is nowhere else to be found with such clarity in our bewildering world. The night sky, as it slowly wheels about the fixed points of the pole and the ecliptic, reflects, to anyone with the capacity for sustained attention, a certain otherworldly order, superior to all flux and contingency, a sign and indeed a reassurance that, where all else fails, something of law, of eternity, and of intelligence remains. Least of all is this impression a unique invention of modern science, with its unrelenting reduction of heavenly patterns to mechanistic and predictable motions. Rather, it is the direct descendant of an ancient and far more powerful intuition, that the sky above is a living book in which the story of the world is written. If, then, it strikes us as strange to speak of astrological ages as a category with which to think both cosmology and psychology, we would do well to remember that this strangeness is itself the result of our modern prejudice for the obvious and the material, and of the embarrassments of an age suddenly unsure of the meaning of its own labour. To the earliest men and women, the stars were not dead matter, but living archetypes, gods and demiurges, spirits and omens, whose grandeur and order proclaimed not only the measure of daytime rhythms and seasons, but the deepest cycles of history and the fate of psyche itself. The sky, then as now, was both the mirror of the earth and a key to the labyrinth within. It is in this context that we may approach the question of the precession of the equinoxes. If we are to elevate this purely astronomical phenomenon to the dignity of a psychological principle or historical framework, we must know what it is and why it has awakened the interest of thinkers across time and civilizations. To the astronomer, the precession of the equinoxes refers to the slow and stately clockwise rotation of the Earth's axis, caused by the subtle wobble or gyration induced by the gravitational influence of the Sun and Moon on the slightly oblate spheroid of our planet. This wobble traces a slow circle on the celestial sphere and causes the celestial pole to complete a circuit every 25,800 years, more or less. As a consequence, the point at which the Sun crosses the celestial equator at the vernal equinox, the so-called first point of Aries, shifts gradually, year by year, like the unseen hand of a cosmic clock, moving backwards through the band of the zodiac. From the perspective of the sky gazer, each age is marked by the sign in which the Sun is found at the moment of the Northern Hemisphere's spring equinox, shifting slowly, roughly one sign every 2,160 years, from one cosmic influence to the next, as the equinox retrogrades through the 12 signs of the zodiac in reverse order. The immense cycle so traced out, the Great Year, as some ancients called it, or the Platonic year, is itself divided into 12 so-called zodiacal ages, each of which, according to astrological thought and the record of tradition, imparts to human affairs a distinctive character, flavour, or coloration. Just as the individual's birth moment is believed, rightly or wrongly, to impress upon him a unique temperament, so do those who study the sky's larger cycles see in each age of the precessional year a unique impulse, challenge, or destiny for the collective psyche of humanity. Now, it is not my intention to defend the empirical or predictive value of astrology in the fashion of the occultist or debater, nor am I blindly credulous of all the traditions by which the ancients sought to explain what they could not control. But I must insist, even at the cost of offence to some modern minds, that the tendency to see in the sky a reflection of human fate is no mere superstition or residue of magical thinking. On the contrary, the projection of psychic motifs upon the heavens is a spontaneous operation of the archetypal psyche, a process by which the most profound truths about man's inner nature find an outward code or grammar for their expression, a language suited to their complexity, scale, and depth. The macrocosm and the microcosm are not two worlds, but two poles of a single reality, and the as above, so below of the Hermeticists is not a metaphor, but a psychological and, in its own way, scientific statement. There is a profound lesson to be found in the persistence of the doctrine of world ages, and this persistence is not unique to the Platonic tradition or to the cultures of the Mediterranean basin. It is a theme echoed in astonishing variety and unity across the civilizations of India, China, Mesopotamia, Mesoamerica, and indeed as far afield as the indigenous peoples of both hemispheres. The notion that time proceeds not in a linear and wasteful fashion, but as spirals or cycles of descent and renewal, is an image rooted in the very structure of the psyche. It arises wherever men and women are faced with the problem of repetition and change, whether in the seasons, the life of the soul, the rhythm of work and death, great contests of nations. In India, for example, the doctrine of yugas, or ages, situates the present epoch, the Kali Yuga, not as a meaningless postlude to a vanished golden era, but as the necessary nadir from which a new age will arise, purifying humanity and restoring the balance lost by descent into darkness. The Vedic and later Indian descriptions of the cycles, Satya Yuga, Treta Yuga, Dvapara Yuga, and finally Kali Yuga, are not only metaphors for inner development, but also intricate cosmologies with precise durations, correspondences, and effects. These ages, unlike the arbitrary divisions of modern historians, serve as the archetypal backdrop against which all events take place. Epochs of light and darkness, growth and decay, descent into forgetting and cycles of remembering, culminating not in annihilation, but in a new dawn. So too, in the world of Greece and Rome, the doctrine of the four ages, gold, silver, bronze and iron, articulates a schema of progressive decline, but one that is never without hope of renewal. Plato's myth of the Atlanteans, Ovid's poetic vision of the decay of the gods, and the Pythagorean cycles of return, palingenesia, indicate not only the grandeur of memory or the terror of anticipation, but the recurrent hope that the cycle will begin anew. The great year of 36,000 or 24,000 years, whether calculated by fixed stars, lunar cycles, or planetary returns, testifies to the cosmic scale on which human life has always situated itself. The world ages, then, whether defined by the stars or by myths of flood and fire, bear witness to an irreducible psychic need. That time, to be meaningful, must itself partake of the archetypal rhythm of birth, death, and rebirth. The Bible, with its characteristic economy, preserves the same intuition in the language of prophecy. The book of Daniel and Revelation, products of the Hellenistic world, but deeply rooted in the tradition of Israel, speak repeatedly of sequences of kingdoms, of the rise and fall of empires, of the struggle between higher and lower powers. Here, the chronology may be less astronomically explicit, but the archetypal and visionary content is unmistakable. The conflict between Michael and the dragon, between the woman clothed with the sun and the great red beast, is not merely the projection of apocalyptic anxiety, but an enactment in visionary time of the same cosmic drama seen also in the processional movements of the heavens above. Nor must we forget the cultures of the New World, which developed, and in some cases preserved, despite war and conquest, systems of cosmology and chronology as intricate as anything in the European or Asian tradition. The Aztec sunstone with its schema of successive suns, each destroyed by cosmic cataclysm, and the Mayan long count with its mathematically exact repetitions of cycles of creation and renewal, both indicate a view of history in which humanity is situated not as an anomaly, but as the living intersection of heaven, earth, and the divine. In these cultures, no less than in our own, the sky does not merely mark time, but constitutes the eternal theatre in which human destinies are played out against a background of unimaginable profundity. But for the modern mind, all this is only a cautionary example of man's tendency to project himself onto the heavens, to anthropomorphize the inhuman, and to mistake metaphors for facts. Yet there is a strange irony here. For the very mechanism by which such projections are possible is itself rooted in facts as real and irreducible as any in science, namely the archetypes and the inner structure of the psyche. If psychological research has taught us anything, it is that meaning cannot be manufactured apart from the symbols and stories in which psyche finds its home. The structuring of time into meaningful units, the articulation of beginning, middle and end, not chronology but kairos, the fullness of time, is as much the condition for collective as for individual coherence. The ages that rise and fall in myth and legend, in prophecy and revelation, are not only the outward markers of terrestrial events, but the synchronistic pattern of inner change reflected in collective experience as the archetype demands expression. Why then Should the precession of the equinoxes hold such fascination for the reflective soul and bear such psychological weight? For it is not merely the slow grandeur of its duration, nor its mathematical elegance that recommends it to us as a model of world ages. Rather, it is the unique coherence of objective astronomical cycles with the patterns and durations of mythology, prophecy, and inner transformation. The perfect image of time that is both measure and meaning, neither arbitrary nor chaotic, but a dance of the psyche with the cosmos. It becomes clear when one reflects upon this that each precessional age, as demarcated by the sun's passage through a zodiacal sign, serves as a natural vessel for the psychic themes and archetypal energies constellated in that span of centuries. The collective psyche, confronted by the enormity of historical change and the challenges of survival, collectively experiences and enacts the particular mood of the ruling sign, a psychological climate composed not solely of outward events, but also of the deepest longings, anxieties, hopes, and projections of meaning. In this sense, the ages become not omens of fate imposed from above, but mirrors of the evolving inner drama of the human race, a canvas upon which history itself becomes transparent to the archetypal and numinous. This is not to say, of course, that there exists a causal relation between the precession and specific affairs. Astrology, in this sense, is a kind of synchronistic language, not a mechanistic force. The psyche and the cosmos move in parallel patterns, not because one determines the other in some Newtonian tyranny of cause and effect, but because both reflect the same underlying archetypal matrix, the same deep structure of order. The significations attributed to the zodiacal signs, historically developed and filtered through diverse cultures, are themselves the result of observation and intuition, and not of abstract speculation. Each sign has drawn to itself, over millennia, a host of associations, animal, vegetable, mineral, legendary, historical, religious, by which the psyche signals its affinity with certain powers and possibilities. This is the language of the stars, not an objective dictate of nature, but a shared lexicon of order and recognition. When we speak, therefore, of an age of Pisces or an age of Aquarius, we are not simply attaching a poetic name to a set of years. We are, more deeply, acknowledging the psychic truth that the human meaning of history is disclosed, not in the facts and dates alone, but in the dream symbols of which those facts are only outward tokens. The astrological ages thus bear witness to the ceaseless and ever-new drama of individuation at the scale of the species, the struggle of the soul to know itself, the endless confrontation with shadow, animus and anima, with death and rebirth, and the transcendent mystery of the self. There is a certain justice, even economy, in the modern astronomer's oft-noted return to myth. Despite his best efforts, the very heavens he so meticulously catalogues resist reduction to a lifeless abstraction. The new cosmos is paradoxically a rediscovery of the oldest, a sky woven through with mythic archetypes, with tales of gods and monsters, lovers and enemies, creative energies and dissolving powers. The universe is not diminished by increase in knowledge, but rendered deeper, more numinous, more essentially the image of the soul's own archetypal terrain. In this light, the precession of the equinoxes becomes a fitting symbol for that mysterious union of fixity and change which so characterizes the archetype. Each age is unique, but all share the same underlying pattern, the same necessity of cyclic completion. Each bears its own special motif, even its shadow, but all speak with a single voice, the voice of a whole struggling through a succession of parts, a process always yearning for the completeness that alone brings peace. Thus it is that the great wheels of time in archaic cosmologies are not naive or accidental, but describe with extraordinary precision the interplay of soul and cosmos. The wobbling of the Earth's axis becomes something far greater than a technical curiosity. It mirrors back to us the possibility that human history, with all its suffering and glory, might itself be a necessary and meaningful moment in the divine life of the world. For whatever the fate of the individual or the nation, death must become life again. The road must find its return to the source. The dream must take on the flesh of time. If we, in our own age, succeed in seeing the ages with new eyes, not as dead reckonings of forgotten fears, but as living metaphors, then our task will be not to predict the future, but to remember the depth, pattern, and wholeness that have always been our inheritance. The cosmos in its vastness is a code spoken in the native language of the soul. To forget this is to wander, lost and homeless, amid ceaseless novelty without meaning. To remember it is to find a home once more in the living world, at the heart of whose mystery our own gnosis awaits discovery and unfolding. As we proceed now to the particular symbols, stories, and psychological import of these ancient ages, our guiding principle, learned from the heavens and the depths alike, must be that nothing is dead that has ever lived in soul, and nothing in soul is foreign to that celestial drama which spins unseen beyond all time, yet speaks to us tonight, as it spoke to the first stargazer, in the quiet sanctity of wonder. Section 2. Between Science and Myth, a Historical Problem. Of all the traditions that link man to the heavens, none is at once so ancient, so pervasive, and yet so misunderstood in the modern world as astrology. Indeed, it is not only the intellectualist or partisan of science who recoils from such an enquiry, but even the ordinary man and woman schooled in preconceptions of empiricism, for whom astrology presents an embarrassment, a relic of the time before mind was educated in the ways of material causality. Yet, as I have said, no honest encounter with the past or with the workings of the psyche allows us to ignore the enduring fascination and symbolic dignity of the astrological record. If, as psychologists, we are enjoined to first do no harm, how much graver is the injury when we excise from the body of tradition those elements which, far from being impertinent, are, in fact, central to the soul's view of the cosmos. The modern world, drunk with the apparatus of prediction and technological mastery, has largely forgotten what earlier ages took for granted. That meaning always prefigures mechanism, that the world is not the creation of causes alone, but is made whole and comprehensible by imagination and myth. Even so, we must recognise that astrology occupies a peculiar place, a borderland, if you will, between the hard-won methods of empirical science and the cloudier kingdom of religious and poetic image. It is no contradiction to say that astrology is, at its historical root, the first science. Indeed, it is the very mother of astronomy, mathematics, and even chronology itself. The Babylonians, whose observations of the heavens are among the earliest reliably dated and recorded in our collective memory, were first and foremost astrologers. Priests and dreamers, yes, but also acute observers, collecting tables of planetary positions, cataloguing eclipses and inscribing on burnt clay the subtle variations of the heavens over centuries. It was not by accident that they divided the sphere into 360 degrees, arrived at sophisticated solutions to the problem of retrograde motion, or described with uncanny accuracy the transits and progressions of the fixed stars. Egyptian and Mayan astronomers compiled calendars so precise that modern science, after years of labour, has been able to confirm their correction to within seconds. The entire structure of timekeeping, navigation, and calendrical calculation on which our world depends is the direct beneficiary of this tradition. Yet when it came time to divide the heavens for use as almanac, timepiece, or matrix of cosmic events, these early scientists turned not to abstract formulae, but to the living forms of zodiacal signs, the gods and heroes in whom they saw, not fantasy, but the signatures of psychic and natural order. To the fathers of science, Kepler, Copernicus, Galileo, and Newton, astrology was not a delusion, but a philosophical necessity. They believed, deeply and without irony, that the movement of the planets and the seasons was a language, albeit often hard to read, in which the mind of God was written, and in which the psyche could discern its fate, possibilities, and dangers. It was only with the rise of enlightenment and empiricism that this meaning was systematically divorced from the mechanism that so delighted philosophers and mathematicians. There was no single moment of rupture, rather a slow and ambiguous parting of the ways, in which alchemy and astrology, deprived of their mythic and religious function, were separated from what remained of science, a corpus cleansed of the taint of magic, but also stripped, in the long run, of the greater portion of wonder. At this point, we must insert a psychological observation. The soul is not fooled by such stratagems. What was contained before in science now overflows into myth, art, and unacknowledged social projections, or, failing these outlets, returns as neurosis, symptom, and strangely as pseudoscientific dogma. For the underlying principle of wholeness, denied in its natural home, will insist upon expression, however the waking ego may protest. As Goethe well knew and dramatised in Faust, the magus and the rationalist are not separate persons. The dichotomy persists in every age and within every psyche. But if the course of science involved by necessity a parting from its mythic roots, it also confronted the inevitable return of paradox. Having succeeded in removing myth from its programme, science became ever more bewildered by the alien, unpredictable and irreducible mysteries disclosed at its new frontiers, the uncertainty principle of quantum physics, the causality of events at the subatomic level, the counterintuitive laws of relativity and chaos, and the study of unpredictability in complex systems. The discoveries of the new science have sorely tried the original ambition for predictability and control, and one is tempted to say that the death of astrology in the public mind has been the prelude to the resurrection of the very meanings it sought to describe, albeit in a new and unexpected language. Let us be clear. The modern psyche, for all its emphasis on engineering and proof, has not ceased to generate myths, even scientific ones. We have not abolished the story of creation, but merely changed its vocabulary. The Big Bang now occupies the seat of Genesis, and natural selection that of providence. The origin and fate of the universe, the emergence of life, and the ultimate destiny of the individual, all these questions remain unanswered and indeed unanswerable by mechanism alone. Nor has science provided, at its altar, a theory of mind or a psychology that could satisfy the needs of the soul. Wherever I have practiced the analytic arts, I have found, in dreams and symptoms, the persistent reappearance of mythic motifs, the gods, cycles, metamorphoses, deaths and rebirths, monsters, omens, auguries, and the very symbolic lexicon which science had set out to explain away, or in its failure to ignore. What, then, are we to make of astrology in this landscape? Is it a survivor, a fossil, or an unacknowledged prophet? The answer, I think, is complex. Astrology is not a science in the modern sense. It can neither predict with mechanical accuracy nor control the outcome of individual or collective affairs. That which it predicts, if it does, should be understood not as an event per se, but as a possibility, a meaning or motif, arising synchronistically with the pattern of outward occurrences. The signification of an alignment, eclipse, or transition is therefore not a mechanism to be deciphered, but a psychic image corresponding in inner time to an outer moment. That astrologers disagree about details or fail in their attempts at fortune-telling does not by itself render their entire discipline spurious. Religion, too, has its many sects, dogmas, and discredited prophets, without for this reason losing its claim to psychological and spiritual value. The great merit of astrology lies not in its predictions, but in its ability to transpose the facts of lived experience into a grander order, a cycle of value and possibility in which events are not simply happenings, but moments of participation in a drama whose scope transcends the personal. For this reason, I have held, and continue to hold, that astrology presents both a profound and a primitive picture of the psyche's operation. It is profound, because the system of correspondences, archetypes, and analogies latent in the zodiac maps a true grammar of the soul, and it is primitive because, as with all systems prior to rational empiricism, it is expressed in pictures, stories, and myth, not in formulae and codes. That this grammar is sometimes inconsistent, or that the astrologer's intuition fails to read the correct significance, is not grounds for its wholesale rejection, any more than the imperfections of science are reason to abandon its search for knowledge. The real problem is not between astrology and science, but between different modes of knowing, the logos and the mythos, the rational and the analogical. The psyche employs both, and human history shows that catastrophe follows whenever one is exalted to the exclusion of the other. The value of astrology lies not in its power to explain everything, but in the way its language makes possible a marriage of opposites, a sacred conjunction of matter and spirit, time and eternity, psyche and world, whose product is the meaning without which no life is endurable. It is a solely psychological question, however, whether the inner significance of such a system can be found compelling and transformative. To answer it, we must observe the spontaneous correspondences that arise between dreams and events, between the birth time of a soul and its biography, between the world historical epochs and the changing inner pattern of belief, fear, and hope. I am not a believer in astrology, rather I am compelled by demonstration to take seriously the analogical correspondences it claims. I have observed in case after case the uncanny way that the symbols of the zodiac, the precessional ages, or the planetary cycles emerge spontaneously in the prior imagery of dreams, in fantasy and in visions reported to me long before the dreamer has acquired knowledge of astrological systems. This uncanny fact, disagreeable as it may be to the positivist, suggests that the psyche has an affinity for such patterns, that it resonates to the language of the stars, not in an outwardly deterministic fashion, but internally as a harmonious whole seeking completion. The heavens become a map for the psyche, and the rhythms of the ages, a story in which every human being is at once an individual and a participant in something far vaster, a destiny shared with the ancestors and the gods. We should not be surprised, then, when modernity finds itself returning, tentatively and with a half-conscious mixture of yearning and scepticism, to forms and practices it once cast aside. What is long suppressed does not thereby disappear from psychic life. Rather, it accumulates beneath the surface, gaining the mysterious quality the alchemists called virtus dormitiva, a latent power or meaning that grows all the stronger for its neglect. In dreams, works of art, resurgent religions, or that self-styled spirituality so characteristic of our time, the psyche spontaneously restores those forms it cannot do without, forms that give time structure, give life purpose, and give the ego a context in which it can willingly serve the depth from which it was born. Astrology, in this sense, answers a psychological need that no other discipline quite fulfills. Like myth, sacred story, or symbol, it offers a binding of the particulars to the whole, a recognition of one's small place within the starry vault, yet paradoxically a sense of dignity and participation lacking to any vision that seeks only to reduce. In the sky we behold the pattern that not only rules us from without, as the wanderings of the planets or the coming of winter, but stirs within as hope, letter, prophecy, and command. To recognize this is not to indulge in superstition, but to acknowledge a perennial truth of the human soul. The idea of a star soul, as Plato put it, or the notion that heaven and earth conspire to engender meaning together. These are not alien intrusions upon the modern psyche, but belong to its innermost ground. And it is in just such symbols that the psyche finds guidance for the work that still remains to be done, the reintegration of soul with body, of mind with the cosmos, of the present with the mystery of the past and the future. So long as we deny by fiat the forms by which such meanings seek their incarnation, we rob ourselves not only of order, but of that most vital necessity, relationship, and wither in consequence, as a leaf cut from its branch, adrift in a wind not of our own making. Thus, if we are to see aright, we would do well to treat the testimonies of the ancient world, the dreams of the modern man, and the weirdly precise patterns of outer and inner cosmology with a humility never out of place before the unknown. For the story of astrology's fall from great science to great embarrassment is a parable of what happens when meaning is banished in favour of an empty competence, and when knowledge is asked to walk alone, without the staff and cloak of imagination. As the modern psyche seeks new symbols to inhabit its future, we may hazard the prediction, without fear of contradiction, that the forms of the past, disdained and exiled though they have been, will return. Indeed, they are already returning, and with a vengeance. Let us not be the last to welcome them, but instead their interpreters and shepherds, for they come bearing gifts essential to life, and in their train the restoration, unknown until then, of the whole meaning of the world. Section 3. The symbolic imagination and the language of the stars. While the average modern mind is apt to separate sharply between astronomy as a reputable science and astrology as a dismissed superstition, we have begun to glimpse the error and indeed the poverty in such simplistic dichotomies. The soul and the collective psyche, which is its aggregate, does not thrive in conditions of excessive abstraction, divorced from image, story, and tradition. It moves rather in the realm of symbols. And nowhere does this propensity reveal itself more instructively or more poignantly, than in the persistent and trans-historical language of the stars. For it is not merely to gratify curiosity, but to satisfy an indwelling psychic demand, that cultures the world over have turned their eyes to the heavens and given to the otherwise mute stellar configurations the names, forms, and characters of gods, heroes, monsters, and destinies. The astrological signs, in this sense, are far more than arbitrary conventions or memorials to dead epics. They are, as I have come to see, genuine products of the symbolic imagination, psychic realities condensed into objective constellations, projected as one would project in a dream upon the screen of night, receiving back from the darkness a confirmation of that secret world within. To consider, for example, the ancient sign of Taurus is to recall not merely the image of the bull, but the long procession of myths, sacrifices, artistic motifs, and psychological attitudes for which this figure stands. The cult of the bull, found in such far-flung civilizations as Minoan Crete, ancient Sumer, the Ice Age caves of Lascaux, the Mithraic rituals of Rome, and the temples of northern India, points to a universal archetype, the sacred animal, the cosmic victim, the embodiment of sexual and spiritual fertility, the dangerous and yet necessary energy whose blood is required to regenerate the world. Nor is this true of Taurus alone. Each symbol, by the law of the psyche, attracts to itself the motifs and complexes corresponding to its signature. Aries, the ram, is not solely the harbinger of springtide in the Jewish tradition, with the lamb of the Passover and the sacrificial theme of Isaac, but further back, across continents and ages, the image of the leader, the overleaper, the cunning and violence of the scapegoat, the strength of the isolated principle of beginnings. Pisces, the fishes, gathers into its net the entire archetypal repertoire of water, life, death, and rebirth, the origins and endings of time, as reflected in the story of Jonah, Christ, and the Fisher King. These images, though overlaid in any given culture with specific associations, do not lose their psychic core when transferred to a different scene. Rather, they adapt, mutate, and draw to themselves new emotional tones, new contradictions, new needs for integration. The force of the ancient symbol is never neutralized by the rational explanations sometimes given by the latecomers of history. Psychologically speaking, it is not possible to abolish the memory of a ritual or remediate the loss of a god simply by decree. The psyche will return, despite all efforts at repression, to the language that alone can satisfy its inner demand. In this sense, the recurring motifs of astrology are the living grammar of the soul, dynamic systems whose grammar and vocabulary are always evolving, yet regular and intelligible. For the symbol is not a fossil, but a perennial principle, and its forms, though capable of carrying contradiction, are not rendered meaningless by the refusal of the waking mind to entertain paradox. This, in part, is why I have argued that the psyche is self-organizing. It will bring forth, from even the most impoverished or derelict conditions, new forms in which life may continue, or in which the memory of an earlier, more comprehensive wholeness may be restored. To the modern psychologist, the continued presence of astrological symbols in dreams, art, and collective fantasy is proof not of occultism or regression, but of the inescapably archetypal nature of psychic life. By archetypal, I do not mean fixed or static forms, but organizing tendencies that produce image, emotion, and pattern, whether the individual is conscious of them or not. The dogmatic religions, in their wiser moments, recognize this reality by incorporating astrological, seasonal, and cosmic rhythms into their rites and stories. This is not to say their intention was astrological, but only that the psyche cannot rest in contentment apart from the recognition of time, space, and inward necessity as integral aspects of its own structure. It is precisely this language, half forgotten and yet continually renewed in symbol and image, that animates the major transitions of culture. The recurring movements of revolution, renaissance, and rebirth, and the inward migrations that characterize both neurotic struggle and the religious quest for liberating knowledge. In the study of the psyche, there is no substitute for attention to the actual patterns of experience, and the recurring presence of astrological symbols, even where their conscious meaning is opaque, signals the persistence of an ancient mode of knowing, a way of organizing the raw data of sensation and emotion into what the medieval alchemists called the unus mundus, the unified world of outer and inner, above and below, soul and cosmos. This unity, however, is not fixed once and for all. It is dynamic, achieved moment by moment, and always on the brink of dissolution. For the individual, this means that the language of the stars is as much a language of crisis as of promise. Today's order may be tomorrow's chaos, and the inward harmony achieved at one level will surely be taxed and even broken by the upward thrust of new archetypal content. The psyche, in this sense, is a crucible for the elements of experience. It seeks purification, refinement, but also an unending cycle of combination and renewal. Here we see, perhaps more clearly than elsewhere, the basic structure of the archetypal drama. The language of the stars is, after all, a language of alternation, rhythm, and qualitative change. The transition from fire to earth to air to water, the movement from individual to collective, the struggle between opposites expressed as the conjunction of planets, the movement of sun and moon. In every case, what is revealed is not an absolute order, but a constellation, a momentary alignment of opposites that has the character not of machine, but of living presence, dramatic and consequential. This is why the astrological record, viewed across the centuries, does not disappoint even when its predictive accuracy falters. As I have said, it is not mechanism to which the psyche responds, but to meaning carried in image and sound. The ancients were correct, in my view, to see their maps of the heavens as keys to the psychology of nation and individual. They were wise to incorporate into their theology not only the geometry of the stars, but also the stories in which those geometric truths found their natural and spontaneous shaping. It is fashionable today to ridicule the belief that the heavens, or the divine for that matter, should trouble itself with human affairs. Yet this ridicule is, I suspect, a displacement of anxiety. The unconscious knowledge that human beings, so far from being insignificant, are the indispensable participants in any realization of meaning. The image of the zodiac is not simply imposed by man upon the stars. It is summoned forth from their present reality as a pattern prefigured in psyche and cosmos alike, a principle of engagement, recognition, and transformation. The music of the spheres is, in this way, not only an outward play of forces, but an inward melody to which the invisible dancer of the soul responds without resistance or complaint. What, then, is the function of such a language? It is, first of all, an instrument of individuation, of the movement, that is, from collective life and the undifferentiated mass toward some unique and hard-won integration of opposites. The charting of birth, experience, possibility and fate is not an external exercise for the exercise's sake, but directed, like all symbolic life, toward the formation of a unified centre. This centre, aimed at consciously or unconsciously, is the self, a reality as much greater than ego as the sun is greater than any individual planet. By reading and responding to the symbolic language of the stars, the ego is reminded daily of its limited yet indispensable station. It is part of a whole not its own making, and yet it serves that whole, actively, intentionally, and with the freedom that comes only to those capable of real humility. Nor can the language of the stars be set aside as archaic or accidental. Like the stories we tell about gods and monsters, about the creation and the end of the world, about journeys to the underworld or the heights of heaven, the astrological image presents and enacts, not simply records, a truth about the mystery of time, namely that every cycle is unique, every moment is both in time and outside of it, and every pattern is grounded in paradox. The modern contempt for such patterns, so easily marketed as progress, is in fact a regression to a lower mode of consciousness, one in which the life of the soul is dulled, its energies are scattered, and its possibilities for integration are sold to the devil of mere specification. The return of the astrological symbol, whether in dreams, fantasy, or true intellectual conversion, marks, therefore, not a fall from enlightenment, but a necessary step in the restoration of the world. Consider, for example, the movement of the equinoxes from the sign of Aries to that of Pisces, or more immediately from Pisces into Aquarius. For Christendom, the advent of Jesus was the signal for a new age. The fishes of Pisces often figured openly in the stories of the disciples, in the reference to fishermen and net casting, in the shared meal of fish on the shore and the multiplication of loaves and fishes among the multitudes. On one level, of course, these images are simply the outward trappings of faith. But for the unconscious, they serve as the key nodes around which intuitive understanding is constellated, a means of giving shape to the content of revelation, of feeling one's place in a new order of time, a living participation in the drama of cosmic return. It was no accident, moreover, that Christ himself was often depicted as the ichthys, the sacred fish, or that the prophecy, "I will make you fishers of men," Matthew 4:19. Set the inward work of the apostles in the language of the outward and ongoing transformation of history. For the collective psyche of the time, the passage from Aries, already worn and embattled by the rise and fall of empires, the martyred prophets, and the endless blood of ritual violence, into the water sign of Pisces, marked not only an epochal, but a psychological transformation. The world age became, in effect, the projection screen by which a new God image could be born in the soul of humanity, with the drama of water, descent, death, and resurrection experienced within as well as displayed without. Throughout the age of Pisces, this symbol continued to inform the evolution of Western Christianity, even as it was imported and adapted to existing pagan myths. The ancient motifs of Dagon, Atargatis, Aphrodite on the shell, and countless others, already alive in the Middle East and Mediterranean long before the Christian faith, were gradually assimilated so that the symbol of the fish, or of baptism by water, or the mystery of descent to the underworld, gained depth and intensity from the layered meanings accrued over indexical generations. Here, again, we see the truth that the psyche is always already at work, giving shape to the formless and perpetual process of transformation. But if the previous transition, Aryan to Piscean, brought change through water, sacrifice, and the unconscious power of shape-shifting and adaptation, what then is to be expected from the coming age of Aquarius? For this sign, associated from time immemorial with knowledge, awakening, paradox, revolution, and the sudden overturning of established orders, signals the further movement of the collective psyche toward the air element, a dispensation of ideas, symbols, and meanings more abstract, less easily grounded in the sensual reality of fire or earth, more prone to flight, instability, polarization, and flashes of enlightenment, cathartic for their suddenness and volatility. Already we may discern in the breakdown of old formulas, in the challenges to authority, in the explosion of new technologies and modes of communication, the operation of this new symbol within the deeper structure of the soul. The astrological background is no mere influence in the mechanical sense, but a reflection of the archetype's intention to give body and form to a collective mood, an emerging necessity of transformation. The challenge of Aquarius will not be met by the discipline of the senses, the cultivation of feeling, or the humility of mortal creatures before fate. It will rather be achieved through the effort to integrate mind, spirit, technology, and collective responsibility in new forms of living together, in network mutuality and vision. There is, of course, no guarantee that this transition will be smooth or peaceable. On the contrary, the movement from one age to the next is typically marked by crisis, breakdown, conflict, and the loss of outward symbols before the new forms are fully born. The language of the stars, then, is not only a manual for comfort, but, as the ancient myths repeatedly show, a warning for those who would remain unconscious of their own participation in the unfolding story. The disaster of materialism, war, and spiritual confusion already visible on the horizon is, in this sense, the outward manifestation of a psychic struggle as old as the gods, the contest between death and rebirth, between the divided ego and its unaccommodated shadow. To be forewarned is to be forearmed. Jung's famous exhortation that we must hold the opposites together in ourselves for the eternal mystery to state its case is nowhere more urgent than here. The language of the stars can serve as an instrument for this very task, not by providing a simple answer or an external guide, but by returning us, again and again, to the paradoxical centre from which new forms arise. In the very complexity, multiplicity, ambiguity, and shifting valence of astrological symbols, we find the signatures of full and unrepressed humanity, called now to respond to the emergent patterning of a world that may no longer be named, nor navigated, nor endured apart from the full participation of the living soul. Let us not imagine, however, that this is a task for the individual alone. The story of the ages is always the story of the many, the we, the body politic. In short, of the living community of souls. The symbol, as Jung often stressed, is a reality whose power cannot be grasped other than through shared experience, collective sacrifice, and the creative intercourse of persons, guilds, states, and civilizations. In every era, the enduring greatness of a people is measured by its capacity to forge new meaning from received symbols, to engage in the labour of myth-making, and thereby to give to the local, the particular, the individual, a dignity and wholeness vouchsafed by the archetype, and never by deterministic mechanism. The zodiac, to cite but one instance, is not the property of history, but a living presence in the now. We, who stand at the hinge of ages, are not the victims of fate, nor the abused children of gods lost to sight. We are, rather, the current inheritors and stewards of the world's meaning. Our daily task is to make this meaning new again, to relate the particularities of our struggle to the ancient grammar in which nature, fate, soul, and the cosmos become one. In every birth, every relationship, every crisis or accomplishment, the living energy of symbol attends us. If the night sky seems, at times, only a mute confusion, the fault lies not in the sky, but in our lack of proper faith and ceaseless attention. For the meaning that is waiting there cannot be imposed, but is given to those who dare to inhabit the interval between the already known and the ever new, between the more of the same and the unexpected gestation of what will surpass, not merely repeat, the greatness of its own foundations. We must be then both astrologers and astronomers, interpreters of symbol and objective observers of pattern. We must learn how to speak simultaneously the language of the spirit and the language of science, to acquire the grammatical competence of the old discipline, but wedded now and in the centuries to come, to a rigour sharper and more comprehensive. In the fusion of these ways of knowing, there will emerge new forms, new religions, new sciences, new stories, not in defiance of, but in homage to, the ancient language of the stars. The myth of the hero's journey, so often retold, so often misunderstood, begins always with a departure from the common world. The hero or heroine stands apart, gazes at the sky, and in the silence of that action, perceives a rumour, a voice, a warning, or a blessing. The symbol for such a moment is the star, the fire, the sign in heaven. The journey that follows is both unique, the particular story of that life, and yet universal, a reenactment, as every analyst knows, of the deep story trembling, waiting, concealed in the soul. If the journey appears in a time of confusion and self-doubt to have lost its meaning, the fault is not in the failures of life, but in the lack of attention to symbol. The language rests, yet even in its rest, it radiates, waiting for a word, a gesture, a sign that will release again into the world its fruits of healing, inspiration, and unending renewal. There is nothing strange, then, in the return of astrology to the modern world. In its outward forms, it may appear garish, incomplete, even trivial. In its inward force and implicit demand, it is, however, a summons to greatness, perhaps the last and the most urgent invitation ever given us by the unconscious. The language of the stars is not a relic to be buried or exhorted, but the grammar, perennial and imperishable, of the soul's own highest conversation with itself. To learn it is to ally oneself with a wisdom older than science, and yet, paradoxically, that which alone can bring about the new birth of the human, the unending maturation of the world. Wherever this rich, archaic language reasserts itself in the analytic session or the visionary work of the artist, it must not be met with embarrassment or cynicism, but with considered respect, indeed a holy curiosity. It is the self-regulating nature of the psyche through night and ordeal that opens the ego to such symbol as guide and teacher. One must be wary, then, of rationalist or sectarian cynicism, for every cynic ignores the primitive physician within. The language of the stars, for all its readiness to confer wholeness, will not rescue those who shirk individuation. Rather, it tasks the waking personality with discomfort and moral tension. The paradoxical truth is that by suffering the meaning, we share in the dignity that gives it birth. Only when ego and symbol stand in creative relationship, never collapsing one into the other, can we hope to attain what the symbol itself gestures toward, which is the union of opposites into the transcendent function of the self. We are ever in danger as moderns of seeking to control the symbol or to peddle it as mere ornament rather than to allow ourselves to be transformed by the encounter. This is the temptation of the age of reason, of technical mastery, and of the reduction of living meaning to mere data or diversion. But the symbolic imagination will abide no such trivialization. When dismissed or deprived of true engagement, it retreats to the shadowed regions of the psyche, from whence it will inevitably reassert itself, often erupting, as history attests, in unanticipated and disorderly ways, in social upheaval, collective delusion, or the sudden unmediated return of the repressed. To recover right relationship with the symbolic, to let the old language of the stars speak authentically in the soul, is to undertake a journey of psychological discipline and ethical growth. Such a journey is not for the faint of heart. One must develop an attitude of reverence and yet, at the same time, a rigorous willingness to decipher and integrate the contradictions inevitably revealed. The old astrological axiom, as above so below, is no mere magic spell, but an injunction to read the outward cosmos as a reflection of inward structure and necessity. In this, the symbolic imagination serves nothing less than the individuation of humanity itself. A new age, a new cycle, a new vision cannot arise without deep death and rebirth of the way symbols organize collective and personal meaning. The language of the stars is therefore not static. It grows, adapts, evolves with us, providing stable attractors in those times when chaos rules and bearing seeds of transformation in every crisis. Those who would stand at the vanguard of culture, artists, seers, therapists, reformers, are wise only to the extent that they remember to listen to this language and allow themselves to become its creatively conscious bearers. Even the shadows of science and technology, for all their dazzling novelty, owe their efficacy to the resonance of symbolic thought that undergirds them. The very metaphors of modern genius, computers, rockets, the genome, the network, draw upon the archetypal wellspring, translating ancient motifs into new forms. True progress, therefore, is not a rejection of the old, but its reimagining, revision, and transvaluation. In the symbolic, the deepest layers of the past live on as possibilities for the future. As we contemplate the languid majesty of the heavens above, let us also remember the heavens within. For in the end, the soul and the cosmos are not separate realities, but mirrored faces of one inscrutable whole, at once boundless and intimate, mysterious and meaning-filled. The symbolic imagination, this secret language of the stars, is the key by which soul and world speak across the ages, opening for every human being a path toward an encompassing and redeeming wholeness. Section 4. The ages as archetypal rhythms, structure and meaning. In all that has been said, we see astrology as the lexicon and syntax of the soul's most ancient efforts to map the chaos of experience, to orient itself in the cosmos, and to anticipate the changes, births, deaths, transformations of order that recur in the fate of individuals and the history of society. Still, one may rightly ask, of all possible ways to segment the flow of time, why turn to the astrological ages, these vast epochs shaped only by the slow drift of the equinox through the constellations? Are we not simply projecting another rhythm on events whose law remains forever hidden? Is there not a subtle danger here, that of mistaking wish for revelation, of imposing structure on phenomena that may, at bottom, be lawless, contingent, or altogether random? I freely admit the risk, nor does it seem to me discouraging. For the soul, risk is not an aberration, but a necessity. It is in the very nature of psyche, when confronted by an unfathomable flow, to seek after symbols, cycles, repetitions, and differentiations that imbue accidental succession with the higher dignity of meaning. Thus, I do not say the astrological ages are the secret history of the world, but rather, in the succession of the ages, psyche has discovered a worthy vessel for the drama of collective and individual transformation. Through the psychological lens, the ages are not merely spans of chronos, quantitative time, but kairos, moments in which the threshold between inner and outer is rendered permeable, and the forces shaping individual development, transits in all their multiplicity, are read onto the canvas of world events, cycles of empire and culture, advances and collapses in science, spirituality, and even the flux of myths themselves. The symbolism of the astrological ages must not, therefore, be mistaken for literal causality. Each age is archetypal, not in the sense of eternal repetition of a closed loop, but as an embodiment of a particular, and to some degree unpredictable, combination of psychological motifs. Aries does not cause the violence, passion, or initiatory heat of a martial era. Rather, its symbols serve to organize and make sensible the eruption of those motifs that, by the law of compensation, balance the shadow and unsatisfied needs of the preceding age. It is no accident that the deepest crises of history correspond to moments of transition between ages, points at which the worn patterns of symbol and order can no longer hold the tension of opposites, and a new and often ambiguous configuration demands its due. It is precisely here that we most need symbolic structure, for inevitable is the confusion that reigns at such moments, and in the absence of mediating symbols and conscious recognition, the collective psyche is driven, as happens in every neurosis, to project the unmetabolized material outward. Whether these projections take the form of scapegoating, fanaticism, war, or the frantic multiplication of beliefs and cults, the underlying principle is always the same. Psychic energy, when denied integration, becomes possessed by the archetype. The otherwise creative forces of the soul are inverted to deprivation and chaos. And yet from this inertia, this blind repetition and distress, there emerges always the possibility of creative breakthrough. The death of the old order is never total. It transmutes, often in apparently random or invisible ways, into patterns latent in the prior age. What was once a god returns as a culture hero. The festival of death becomes a feast of new life. The defeat of an empire becomes the source for centuries of renewed effort, the generation of myth from conquest and suffering. The archetype in each case is never static. Each age builds upon the work of its predecessor, even as it strives to move beyond. The archetypes overlap, intertwine, and modulate. The movement is neither mechanical nor random, but dialectical in the deepest sense. To understand this rhythm, it is necessary to recall that the psyche lives in psychological time, which, unlike the measurable and divisible time of the physicist, obeys the peculiar logic of the dream and the unconscious. Past, present, and future here are held in abeyance. Events and symbols of former epochs live with us as inherited potentials, ready to erupt at any moment as present compulsions or new revelations. Another way of saying this is that the rational mind cannot, in the end, insulate itself from the recursive and repetitive power of the archetype. What we call history repeating is often, in fact, the unconscious rediscovery and reenactment of an archetypal pattern at another scale, in another guise. Yet, if rendered conscious, attended by the depths held up to the light of self-reflection, these modifications of symbol become the source of new energy, new meaning, new healing, and new order. The succession of astrological ages, then, serves as a map, a mythological macrostructure for this undulating process. It marks the passages between cycles not merely in the heavens, but in the soul's striving for wholeness. Where the particulars of time appear senseless or random, the archetype supplies, retroactively, a principle of organization. It bestows dignity to what otherwise would be mere suffering. We are, none of us, cut off from this matrix. In the tiny annals of private pain, as in the great convulsions of continents, we confront again the need for symbol, drama, and meaningful transition. To refer conscious attention to these rhythms is not to indulge in fantastical prophecy or fatalistic acquiescence, but to take full responsibility for the life of symbol, as the only trustworthy mediator between the forces of soul and the outward facts of body and society. But we must be cautious. The rhythmic structure of the ages is always in excess of our ability to control or fully comprehend. However, rigorously we interpret the correspondences that emerge from historical research or reason from the logic of the symbols, the archetype will confound all narrow expectations, bringing out of its inexhaustible treasury variations and contradictions entirely unanticipated. The progression from Aries to Pisces to Aquarius is not a simple substitution of new content for old, nor the permanent obsolescence of earlier archetypal possibilities. On the contrary, the return of ancient patterns often surprises generations who imagine they are immune to the forgotten powers of past forms. In this, the ages are not finally psychological only, but synchronistic. They are inner to the extent that human consciousness appropriates and integrates their symbols, but outer to the degree that phenomena in nature, politics, and history coalesce into form without apparent external cause. I have observed in the lives of patients and in my own encounters with synchronicity that outer events synchronized with inner states often serve as confirming markers, signs in the original sense, that the unconscious is converging on the moment of crisis or opportunity. The same is true, at larger scales, of the historical transitions by which epochs are distinguished. The rise of prophetic figures, the outbreak of conflict or revolution, the invention of new systems of thought or methods for viewing the world often appear as conjoined with or accelerated by punctuations in the rhythm of the great wheel. To be able to respond to these moments, what the ancient Greeks called kairos rather than chronos, is the privilege of those who accept the psyche's right to name its own highest aim. Of crucial importance, then, is the use of astrological rhythms as an instrument for psychic reflection. Instead of simply reacting to the compulsions and anxieties of time, consciously recognizing and welcoming the archetypal shape grants to the individual and to the collective the power to reimagine, to bear consciously the contradictions that would otherwise destroy. This, in psychological terms, is the path of individuation, not merely for the private soul, but for the collective in its passage through the moments of danger and hope that signify movement from one age to the next. Nothing could be more relevant for the modern world, situated as we are in the liminal thresholds between the Piscean and the Aquarian, between the world of sacrifice and the world of reason and revolution, between the collective anima and the collective animus. The labour of consciousness, if it is to fulfil its promises, must shoulder the burden and the glory of that transition, facilitating the reconciliation of the opposites, the continuous dialogue between forgetting and remembering, past and future, masculinity and femininity, instinct and consciousness, nature and culture. The risk, of course, is that we fail to recognise the demands of the moment. This modern danger is heightened in times of accelerating change, the rapid collapse of old beliefs and the proliferation of new ones without substance or root. Here, the structure provided by the cycles of the ages is not a luxury, but a necessity. It offers a framework within which new symbols may be born, a context for the dreams and visions without which no society becomes truly human. To ignore this framework is to court psychic disaster. To acknowledge its presence is to recover the creative power by which meaning is forged and the suffering of time transformed into hope. It is thus not as predictions of next year's weather or tomorrow's politics that the astrological ages serve, but as a living, moving grammar for the eternal conversation between psyche and cosmos. The only value in reading the heavens is the value rendered inwardly to the soul itself, the confirmation that in the end, meaning is not given from without, but articulated, reverberated, and made new from within. Yet the outer heavens still matter. They call forth our attention, our engagement, our responsibility for the world, even as they reflect back to us the progress or danger of our innermost developments. The stars remind us that our story is not one of isolated egos adrift in meaningless space, but a collective epic in which each of us participates as protagonist and witness, victim and redeemer all at once. Herein lies the deepest reason for attending to the archetypal structure of the astrological ages. Their cycles provide a way not to avoid the pain of incarnation, but to bear it meaningfully, to understand where we have come from and where we must yet venture. The greatest religions, philosophies and sciences of mankind all bear the imprint, conscious or not, of these cosmic rhythms. In them, we find the scaffolding upon which the gods build the temples of human meaning anew with every revolution. Yet, as every builder knows, the scaffolding is never an end in itself. It supports the unfinished work, the work that still calls us forward, the towering edifice of spirit as yet incomplete. Let us therefore use the ages as the wise make use of the mirror, not as a vain display of the self, but as a means of sight and honest self-examination, a reminder that the face we bear today is both the offspring of our ancestors and the antecedent of what we may yet become. For those who have eyes to see, the rhythm of the cosmos calls for a daily labour of integration, which is only to say a labour of love. And to paraphrase the New Testament, Though the outward ages pass away, the logoi, the archetypal words, remain indestructible, awaiting their fulfillment in us. Thus stands the invitation posed by the cycles and symbols of the stars, that in them the soul's grammar, and therefore its ultimate song, may be heard anew with every rise and fall of time. For in the end, the meaning of the ages is the meaning of psyche, and the goal of every symbol is not stasis, but the rebirth of the world. The archetypal structure of the astrological ages, then, provides not a prison but a scaffold, a dynamic grammar rather than a set of deterministic rules. Using this symbolic logic, we are enabled not merely to reflect passively on the tides of history, but to take an active part in our own movement towards psychic maturity. The wise are those who embrace both tragedy and comedy, order and disorder, light and shadow, for these opposites are never truly separate, but are always concealed within one another, turning and transforming in the rhythm of the archetypes and of time itself. In finding our place within the flow of these great cycles, we may come to occupy the narrow threshold where memory, attention, and creativity coalesce. That point where, as Heraclitus wrote, life and death, waking and sleeping, war and peace, all become one. In this living apex, we come to learn the final secret of the ages, that the world is the psyche and the psyche the world, and that their division is the very suffering and hidden blessing that calls us home to ourselves and to one another. In this sense, we are not only shaped by the cosmic grammar, but become its living voices, bearing new possibilities to the future and remembering the time when the world was young, the stars close, and every age was charged anew with hope.